The prosecution blew it in the George Zimmerman trial. That's according to a new book which hit bookshelves this weekend. NBC News analyst Lisa Bloom covered the trial, was, quote, astonished by what she witnessed, but she says for her, none of it was a surprise. Suspicious Nation, the inside story of the Trayvon Martin injustice and why we continue to repeat it. It's a bestseller now. It takes the reader through what Bloom says are the 6 biggest mistakes made by the state of Florida in that case. Lisa Bloom's here with us, and before we get to it, we should continue to note that George Zimmerman has sued NBC Universal for defamation. The company strongly denies the allegation. In the book, you claim, among other things, essentially that the attorneys' choices, the prosecution attorneys, their choices were nothing short of astonishing. Where do you believe the prosecution went wrong?
So you and I covered this case together, gavel to gavel for MSNBC. And as I was watching it, I saw a case that was going off the rails. And when it was over, I just couldn't put it behind me because it seemed to me that something very wrong was happening in this case. I had that gut feeling like a lot of people have, but I don't want to just base my opinions on gut feelings. I wanted to know the facts and the evidence. So I went back, did new interviews with witnesses. I start with inside the jury room with a lot of new information there. You know, I think the biggest blunder by the prosecution was missing the smoking gun evidence, which was that George Zimmerman's gun was holstered behind him inside his waistband. He's caught on videotape demonstrating that the day after the shooting. And the prosecution failed to argue that in that case, Trayvon Martin, who Zimmerman says was on top of him, could not have seen and reached for the gun in that position unless he had X-ray vision.
You also write, quote, our laws, beliefs, assumptions, and blind spots combined to create the conditions that led to the death of Trayvon and made Zimmerman's acquittal by far the most likely outcome. What are some of those beliefs and blind spots?
Right. So the question is, why does this continue to repeat? Why is this more than just Trayvon Martin or Jordan Davis or Renisha McBride? And I think there's 3 big factors, which I talk about in the second half of the book. Probably the biggest is racial bias in America. So most of us don't want to think that we're racist. It's such a vile insult. Everybody says they're colorblind and egalitarian. Yet we continue to have these outcomes. So what's going on? And I think at the root of it is something called implicit racial bias. It's a free test you can take online, developed by Harvard University researchers, and many people, myself included, and I reveal this in the book, may be shocked at what you discover when you take that test.
I've taken it, and I was also surprised.
Yeah.
I was also surprised.
About 50% of African Americans test for racial bias against African Americans. About 80% of whites do. So it's very disturbing when you find that out about yourself. The good news is that you can change it. There's hope, and I have a lot of examples in the book about doctors, police, judges, and juries who can make changes once they're aware of these biases.
You also talk a lot in the book about the gun culture that exists in this country and how there is almost one gun per American. And you note the fact that we have the highest rate of gun deaths in the United States of America as well. Who's more to blame for Trayvon Martin's death? Is it the gun culture that exists in this country, the culture that we celebrate, or is it just George Zimmerman?
Well, I think there's a big difference between keeping a gun in your home for self-defense and walking around with a concealed loaded weapon when you're going to target, and that's what George Zimmerman did. And when you add to that this is someone who had a history of shoving a police officer, of having a woman get a restraining order against him, he then got one against her. You know, this is not somebody who should have been walking around with a loaded weapon. And in fact, after this case, Sanford, Florida passed a law that neighborhood watch guys can no longer walk around with loaded weapons. But it's just not safe. And that's why, indeed, we have the highest rate of gun violence in the developed world. If more guns made us safer, we'd be the safest country in the world. But unfortunately, the opposite is true. People
seem to be buying the book, but this is what the LA Times, I'm sure you've seen, this is what the LA Times said about it. At its best, Suspicion Nation is a thorough evisceration of the amateurish job done by the Florida prosecutors who tried Zimmerman. At its worst, it's like turning on the television and listening to yet another annoying television pundit make sport of a human tragedy. What was your hope? What were you trying to accomplish with the book?
I don't understand the second part of that. If people don't like the book, they don't like the book. I don't see how anybody would say this was a sport. This was a painful process, I think, for all of us. It continues to be. What I thought was important was to expose what the prosecution did wrong in this case. These are public officials. They're paid by our tax dollars. They're accountable to us. And for all those people who felt in their gut that something was wrong and who are told, you know, you have to get over it, the system played out, move on, I want wanted to say, you know what, your gut is right, and here's why, from the point of view of the facts and the evidence.
Lisa Bloom, I enjoyed covering that trial with you. You are insightful, if nothing else. I've started the book. It's a good read, so thank you for stopping by and
Thank you, Craig.
and sharing
I appreciate that.
Be well.